Mushoku Tensei, trying to understand the one anime I just can't get through. Short audio review. If you know any of my work, then you already know I have no issues with ecchi, moral ambiguity, or isekai. And yet, the anime to finally defeat me is apparently this, Mushoku Tensei, Part 2. How did this happen? Why can't I get into its glorious production values, and is it overhyped? Today I'd like to take the time to think through all of this a bit. Feel free to join me as we skip the spoiler section to go straight into spoilers ahoy. A big thing to establish would be why this question interests me in the first place. When it comes to genres, Mushoku Tensei is primarily an isekai, fantasy adventure, or ecchi program, with some subheadings of Lolita harem and aging protagonist. Isekai is no problem for me. I love classics from long before Mushoku Tensei, harems like Zero no Tsukaima, or the epic that is Magic Knight Reiat. I even loved what I've seen of Aura Battle of Dumbine. Further, I've no major bug to bear with modern harems either, not just obvious isekais. Not just obvious masterpieces like ReZero or Grimgar, but also silly, fun romps like Shield Hero. So while it is a little annoying people keep calling MT the isekai pioneer, in spite of the author himself wearing much of his influences on his sleeve, I overall have nothing to dislike with the isekai elements. Ecchi presents little issue either. I don't much go out of my way to find fan service, but I am rather fond of the harem genre, not because of any desire to be surrounded by a half dozen, usually mentally unstable or mysteriously ill women/men, but rather because I find harem stories quite upfront and earnest, usually cheap yet passion-filled. It's a fun genre, and when it peaks hard. I didn't write 40,000 words on the shuffle ecchi harem, and the ecchi harem shuffle for no reason. So how about a different angle? Perhaps this is a case of overhype. And while I am frequently disappointed by the show, I think it's undeniable that this is one of the best pieces of TV animation, direction, and scoring of all time. For all my issues with Mushoku Tensei, it's overly abundant that there is no hype in terms of production. No, it deserves every bit of praise it gets on that front. So it strikes me that my issue, and perhaps one others can relate to, comes from the show's framing. Sure, I have lesser issues with how I find the story fairly mundane and mostly predictable in an unenjoyable way, and how for all that Rudius does some work to get his power, he is also still handed a noble birth, the best teachers around, powerful allies who come to his beck and call, and by episode 12 a magic eye that lets him see a couple of seconds into the future, all alongside a speed dial to an omnipotent god. For all that, I think the thing that actually makes this painful to watch is really just the framing. When does a fun comedy ecchi turn into a creepy hentai? Okay, before a potential Mushoku Tensei fan clicks off, I ain't here to play any bullcrap games. In fact, I have a whole piece coming up playing the opposite to this argument. But for now, I believe in the principle of don't like, don't watch. I don't like horror movies. I'm really squeamish, you see. So I don't watch them with only the exception of maybe really important ones to the medium as a whole, and in anime's case, things like Higurashi. That doesn't mean I think the horror genre promotes violence or gore or suffering. I also don't think cartoons are real at all. Lota and Shotokan culture is super complex, and I ain't one for trying to dumb it down to some stupid binary. I've written whole essays trying to mediate the conversation as I understand it. Mushoku Tensei, purely the anime, the light novel I'm not familiar with, as I personally see it, suffers from a few caveats to all this. 1. It isn't framed as ecchi but as high fantasy. 2. Regardless of any ridiculous hand-waving from the handful of super extreme fans, Rudius is nearer 40 years old than not. He acts that way, has the memories of all those years, imagines himself in his dreams as a grown-ass man, and maybe most problematically of all for someone just trying to watch it while ignoring that fact, he thinks in an adult voice, and boy does he think a lot. Even if you want to argue philosophy and say that the body equals your age, not the mind, this doesn't change how uncomfortable it is to listen to a grown man fantasize over young children that are in his power. Like, if Rudius was a reborn soul and he only had glimpses of his past memories, his fears of the outside world and socializing, that I'd be on board with, He's a reborn soul, he gets another chance. He could still be a pervert, I mean, most harem protagonists are. But he is technically a 9-year-old just with that soul, go all religious on this, existentialist on this. The fact is, though, he has the consciousness of a 40-year-old man. 3. There is no counter. I have no issue with Rudius in a vacuum. I believe in showing morally fucked characters, but the property has no active counter, no character commenting on how unequivocally wrong it is for Rudius to be attracted to and actively grooming little girls. To break that down a little, let me use a pretty heavy example, I'm afraid. I could get through all of Kodomo no Genkai. For those who don't immediately wince in painful memory at that title, I'm referring to that one anime about a very young girl trying to actively get in the pants of her homeroom teacher, alongside with her other exploits with her two fellow Lolitas straight-up child friends. It is a show I probably wouldn't have ever gone near were it not for its infamy within the community, a show nigh on impossible to give an accurate score to. It's a show that constantly makes you conflicted on what you're being told, because make no mistake, it has themes and messages, but it also has a lot of very uncomfortable ecchi and fan service. So, what's that got to do with Mushoku Tensei? Well, for one, I'd note this. Kodomo no Genkai doesn't try to ignore its own moral quandaries, though it certainly glorifies the fan service to a degree, as all fan service does. No one ever tries to say that what's happening is okay. In fact, the teachers and adults of the show actively try to put a stop to things, and it has no real attraction to the girl, but rather is constantly presented with massive internal conflicts when she acts like a much older woman than is appropriate for a child, matched with his own youth and sexual inadequacy. Now, to be clear, the show is infamous for a reason. I can't properly score it for a reason. It is not easy to watch, but at least it's honest. The opening and ending are full of fan service to a peppy J-pop track that lets you know what's coming. The premise and the poster art are self-evident. No one tries to make an argument of any merit in favour of pedophilia. The program is what it is. And see, that's what I think gets me in Mushoku Tensei. Lots of bad fate people will tell you that a show like Black Bullet, which I was going to write a much more positive review on, but instead I did this one, is a lolly harem, but it's not. Like, sure, there are a lot of Lolitas, some fan service for them too, here and there, but it's an action drama comedy. The protag has no romantic love for the lollies of the lewd sort, and they in turn are naive of what love really means. In fact, the main romance of the show is actually between the two of-age characters, or at least they're the same age. They are primarily used to look cute and for some thematic stuff that's actually handled decently well. If you were actually into that particular body type and watched Black Bullet purely for it, you would most likely be disappointed. You might have a few designs you like, but I think that person would love MT a lot more. And that isn't necessarily the problem. High School DxD is full of ecchi fun, but the difference is it doesn't normalise it, and this is what I'm getting at about the framing. DxD starts with, again, a bombastic opening song that illustrates this wacky fictional world full of action scenes and boobs. Mushoku Tensei, with its lack of intro animation, starts pretty much every episode with an incredibly produced animated montage, or something similar, of the characters doing whatever to the backing of a proper high fantasy song. And then 5 minutes later, Rudius is ogling at a 12-year-old while internally monologuing about making them his wife or conquest with the voice of a 40-year-old. And that isn't hyperbole, that's just a description of the anime, and an accurate one. And there's no control factor. Using the excuse of the time era, fictional worlds that we're in, mind you, there is no character who calls this behaviour out. And so, even if in 20 or 100 episodes' time, Rudius finally develops to be less of a literal pedophile, until we get there, we just have to live with moment after moment of lewd gazes and unchecked comments on children by a 40-year-old. And it's just a lot to try and sit through. This compounds with other things that might not be so bad on their own. Why is Roxy 12? Like, seriously, why shouldn't I doubt the show's intention when the one of-age character who Rudius is attracted to just so happens to be from a special race that looks super young as adults? And again, we have that in other anime, but it's the compounding factor. Does that not raise a red flag with the rest? Why does Eris and Rudius' physical age, it increases so little between the years of 10 and 13, despite there being a prime aging period for kids? Is it because we want to keep presenting them as Lolitas? Or are we possible, as we can possibly get away with it? Because that's what it comes across as with everything else. The show is too expensive for it to be a case of lazy model work. It feels deliberate. It makes it so hard to watch because it feels dissonant. The trailers, the amazing production, the posters, the hype. It all says this is the king of isekai and high fantasy, and the show backs that up. This show doesn't feel like an ecchi, but it 100% is as much an ecchi as it is anything else. No episode goes by without fan service or lewd humour or uncomfortable monologues from the protag. As the show goes on, it gets harder. I want to think it'll pay off, that Rudius will over time become a compelling, ever-developing character. But for that to happen, we need checks and balances. We need a voice of reason. The God character even. Just someone to remind us that we're not the strange one for thinking a 40-year-old man pursuing kids is a bit weird. The ecchi cannot be in your face without adequate framing. Imagine a version of High School DxD or Sora no Otishimo, where the intros were deadpan, with no fan service and top quality, hyper-detailed art. But then 5 minutes in, it's still a totally normal episode of those shows. It would mess with your head, put simply. Off script for a minute for anyone still watching, especially any Mushoku Tensei fans. I've linked in the iCard and probably the description a counter to all this that came up in my feed, my YouTube feed, literally the day after writing this, because, you know, the Google overlords obviously knew I'd taken an interest in Mushoku Tensei. Things in the video I agree with, in particular the stuff about the character of Paul, and it's a video about maturity in Mushoku Tensei. And watch it 100% regardless of whether you agree or disagree with me. It's great, it's much better made than this. It's just a really good video. However, I think I have to point out its fundamental flaw, and that's that it sees a vision. And this is all going to sound super patronizing, especially considering we're off script here. But if it helps, I genuinely don't mean it to be. When we watch anime, and it's not something we usually word like this, but words like resonate is a word we'd use more often. We resonate with shows. We see visions of shows. If you've ever seen, well, I don't want to spoil things, but let's say when you get to the end of the Gundam's original trilogy of films and Encounters by Daisuke Inu starts playing, you're seeing fucking visions at that point. You might as well be high, you know? And Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann does it for a lot of people. There's a lot of different shows where you just click with the show and it is the best thing ever, and someone could give you 10 compelling reasons for why it's absolute garbage, but in that moment, it is the best thing ever and you're engulfed in it. The whole world disappears and you're just enjoying art, and it's great. Though not often said, I think it's actually one of the biggest reasons we all watch anime, because it's a medium that manages to deliver those moments time and again, which is fascinating. For me, there's a film called Gundam F91, which by most of the Gundam community is seen as a bit of a black sheep. I love Gundam F91. When Eternal Wind starts playing, which is the best song aside from Encounters, I'm in the zone. When the characters are just floating in space, embracing one another, I am in the zone. While the credits, which if you've ever seen that movie are something to behold, are playing, I am in the zone. But Gundam F91 is a fucking dumpster fire. Like, yeah. Objectively speaking, it's about a 7.5 to an 8.5. The production values are great. That said, the pacing is rushed as fuck. It has no definitive ending, even though it does feel fairly conclusionary. Most of the characters get rushed, which is a shame because it almost has the first Gundam female heroine, but she just doesn't get enough screen time to be properly categorized as such. It is brilliant to me, but 90% of people don't get the vision, as it were. They just don't resonate with it. Eternal Wind starts playing, and at best they go, damn, Eternal Wind is a great song. And that's the point. I don't expect anyone who hasn't seen the vision of F91 to think F91 is a masterpiece. I expect them to acknowledge that it has really great animation and brilliant music, except for when it steals Imperial March. But the point is, it's not perfect. I appreciate it's not perfect. I can still love the shit out of it every time I watch it. Just how I love the shit out of Encounters in Space, or Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, or any other show that just clicks with you. For many people, when they watch Mushoku Tensei, what they see is a beautiful show about moral ambiguity, about matureness, and about a young man who was reborn and gets to live life again, and try to be a better person this time and get over his weird hang-ups. The problem is, you can be blinded by a vision, and I feel that with Mushoku Tensei, with the production values and the music and the direction and the character designs and everything, it is making it so easy to cope, as it were. And in your man's review, as linked in the iCard, you know, at one point he goes,
but for all the criticism Mushoku Tensei gets for its sexualization and its fan service, I can say that I never really felt once like the sexualization of its characters was meant for the sake of me, for the sake of the audience. It always felt like there was a purpose behind the ecchi. There was always a character being fleshed out, no pun intended, or a comedic gag to be had that...
And in your man's review, as linked in the iCard, you know, at one point he goes that a lot of the fan service is actually not really fan service, it's actually very intimate. And some of it is, but most of it is pure fan service. And it's the sort of comment only someone who is blinded by a vision can make. It's like me going, F91 isn't rushed at all, it's intentional, because the characters don't get enough time because they're real people, and you never know everyone's life stories. And I mean, that could theoretically be possible, but we'd all know that would be me making a cope for why the film is so rushed. In a similar fashion, there's a lot of that surrounding Mushoku Tensei, because who can blame you? It is so well made. But the thing is, he is a 40-year-old man's consciousness. He is not a resurrected soul with vague memories. See something like Knights and Magic for an example of that, though that show has its own problems. But he is an actual 40-year-old man. From the second he's reborn, he stares at his new mother's breasts and goes, "Wow, breasts." That's not the actions of a reborn soul in a baby's body. And it's very hard to watch through something like that and try to just ignore it in order to appreciate the values. And I totally respect people who do. But if someone else you're talking to hasn't seen the vision, you can't expect them to just ignore it all. You can't expect them to think Eris and Rudius having sex at the end of season 2 is somehow the most intimate, beautiful, mature thing ever.
Is behind and grow stronger, so she's worthy to stand by him in the future. In episode 8, Turning Point 1, Rudius tries to have sex with Eris, and that ultimately ends in failure, not because she doesn't like him, but because she doesn't feel ready. She makes a promise with him that in 5 years, when he turns into an adult, that is when she will be ready, and that's when they can do it. At the end of this journey, after Turning Point 2, Eris has resolved herself, and now she is the one pushing Rudius to have sex, not out of maliciousness, but because she knows it's the last time that she's going to see him, at least for a very long time. What follows is probably the most tasteful, emotionally impactful, resonant sex scene that I've ever seen in an anime, and it's executed in a way that feels like the culmination and payoff of watching one relationship develop over the course of an entire series. It is masterfully done. It is the emotional peak of the entire season, and it's the moment where I truly realized what sets Mushoku Tensei apart from other anime.
If someone else you're talking to hasn't seen the vision, you can't expect them to just ignore it all. You can't expect them to think Eris and Rudius having sex at the end of season 2 is somehow the most intimate, beautiful, mature thing ever. Because it's not. Because Eris thinks she is in love with her slightly younger cousin. Rudius isn't even aiming for her as his main end goal. I haven't always loved every influential show I've watched. Kodomo no Genkai is, again, a very hard watch. But it's interesting in a weird sort of way. The episodes depicting the main girl's backstory is genuinely brilliant. It has messages. It has a twisted but still present form of morality. And it doesn't let the ecchi go completely unchecked. It still does a lot of the time. And it goes, but there is also always a character who would ring the police if they found out things were going too far. And again, that's not an excuse. Kodomo no Genkai goes way too far. A lot. But at least it doesn't pretend to be something else. You know what's coming every episode. It's uncomfortable, but it's deliberate. In Mushoku Tensei episode 13, Rudius tells Eris it took all he had not to fondle her when she was sick and vulnerable on a boat. That in the next ocean trip, he might not be able to resist. Eris says she would be okay with him doing it a little next time.
I'm so glad we made it. I'm never gonna get on a boat again.
You say that, but we'll have to take one from here to the central continent eventually, so get ready.
No. Will you cast healing on me the whole way again?
If you want, but I might have to do something naughty to you.
Please don't tease me like that.
I am not teasing. I'm controlling myself.
Hey, it's all I can do to keep myself in check.
Well, that's fine, I guess. You can touch me a little bit next time if you really want to.
Yeah, no, sorry, a little isn't gonna cut it. Let's just wait until you're ready to get real messed up.
In this scene, we are watching a young girl who has over time been groomed. That's not an exaggeration. She's gone from repelling his advances to being more and more open to it, of thinking she's in love with what she thinks is her younger cousin, but is really a boy with the mind of a middle-aged man who, by his own admission, is more interested in other women, including Selfie, another even younger girl he openly wants to make his child bride. And all of this isn't even the focus. The focus is some generic fantasy romp across some nicely done world building. The focus isn't on how evil this is. In fact, it's almost framed as either comedy or sometimes even wholesome. This blatant grooming element, which has nothing to do with imposing my standards, but is simply the text we're presented with. I'm not even sure it's deliberate. All I have is the word of the novel fans, that it's an amazing slow burn, that Rudius is meant to be this way so he can develop later. But that is the word of the same ones that says it isn't fair, an unfairly overpowered protagonist, that says this show is the most original isekai ever, that says this and that and the other. That word is reliant upon this show getting enough episodes to reach the supposed heel turn. The word I depend on being able to sit through a 40-year-old man wholesomely grooming a girl in his power into thinking she should offer him his body. Her body to him. And I'm sorry, I can't. I will defend the merits of super lovers as a better way for youths to understand their growing fantasies and strange adolescent feelings in a controlled fictional environment as averse to actual pornography. I will discuss the intricate, often hypercritical thinking of the ever-fascinating Kodomo no Genkai. I will never sit here and tell you that a fan service lolly is the same as CP. It just isn't that simple. But Mushoku Tensei does seem simple. It hasn't shown me any instance of deeper feelings on these topics. It doesn't make an effort to counter the depraved behaviour, and it isn't framed right to just be a simple ecchi. It's an uphill battle. I get dismayed when I look at my list and think, oh, I guess I better watch an episode today. I don't find the fantasy that fun, and the production, as mind-bogglingly good as it is, can't overcome the terrifying way it presents such dark subject matter in a wholesome fashion. When I drop things, it's because I'm busy, or a show just isn't for me and doesn't seem important enough to be worth pushing through. Mushoku Tensei is important enough to push through, but I just can't do it. Were MT framed as a pure ecchi, I think I could probably get through it like any other ecchi. Were it focused more actively on the philosophy or character-driven side of the pedo angle, I think I could get through it. But as it is, this show borderline freaks me out. And for that, I'm dropping Mushoku Tensei. I hope if nothing else, perhaps I helped you too put words to something you might have been feeling about this. Whether you like, love or hate the show, just because you appreciate the harem or ecchi, isekai or fantasy genres for any reason, doesn't mean you have to like this show or its screwy framing and morals. At the end of the day, if you don't see the vision for this show, I think it's perfectly understandable to absolutely struggle with it. Thanks for meeting me ramble on this show. I hope you enjoyed Momentie.